Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Welcome, everybody, to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm so excited today to have Dr. Stan Wallace in the house. Stan is a philosopher, theologian, and Christian apologist. He's the president and CEO of Global Scholars. It's an organization that equips Christian professors to serve Christ in secular universities worldwide. Amazing to me. He's also written around 200 articles published in professional and ministry journals on engaging the mind and the culture. He's the co-host of Thinking Christianly, which is a podcast with philosopher and theologian J.P. Moreland. It's, to me, a must for everyone desiring to have a thinking faith. He's also the host of College Faith Podcast, which explores the intersection of Christian conviction and higher education. He is one of the smartest people I know, and he and his wife, Lori, live here in Kansas City, which I just am amazed that we get to live in the same town and be friends. So welcome, Stan, to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast.
Well, thanks, Patrick. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to this.
Well, tell us a little bit about your faith story. I want to hear how it overlaps your backstory of becoming a philosopher and an apologetics expert.
Well, I grew up in a non-Christian home. In fact, my mom, during her years in college, embraced the transcendentalists, sort of New Age before New Age was popular. Emerson, Hemingway, Thoreau. And so I kind of grew up in a New Agey home. She mixed it with some occultist practices. I remember coming home sometime, probably freshman, sophomore year of high school, and there being a seance in my living room. So that was kind of the milieu I was in. And I realized pretty quickly that was a bunch of bunk, and kind of became a pretty antagonistic atheist to anybody who had any spiritual interest or proclivities. So I was the guy in high school who gave all the Christians a hard time and told them they were idiots and raised all the objections to them about why they shouldn't believe in these fairy tales. I had a friend named Gail who was Jewish who actually became a Christian. And I couldn't figure that out. She already had a religion. Why did she need another one? But she wanted to tell me about this Jesus. And I had seen her go through, 4 or 5 cycles of finding something that was all that and wanting to tell me about it. And about 6 months later, she was on to something else. So I figured this too will pass. And 6 months came and went, and she was still trying to tell me about this Jesus. And actually, I was seeing changes in her life I could not explain otherwise. So I started to become interested internally. Externally, I kept the antagonistic facade up and kept drilling her with questions. And she was faithful to say, good question, I have no idea. She'd do her homework, come back later and say, hey, I've done some study. Here's some things you might want to think about. So she started to answer my questions, actually, which was, for me, first and quite disconcerting. Wow. And about a year later, I lost a couple idols in my life that really were the things that were giving me value and meaning, including a relationship with a young woman I was dating. And I came back to Gail and I said, tell me about Jesus. You've been trying to for a year. I've been putting you off. I'm ready. And she shared the gospel. And that night, it was April 21st, 1980, spring of my junior year, I realized Jesus is who he claimed to be and worth my life. And I trusted him. And I remember going to high school the next day and didn't tell anybody. Nobody knew about this. I didn't actually trust Christ with Gail. I went home later and did so in my room. But the next day, people started to come up to me and say, what happened to you?
Wow.
And I'd say, I don't know. What do you mean? So, you look different. I said, I don't know. All I know is I decided last night Jesus is God and I'm going to follow him. And everything seems different today. The whole world was different to me. And that went on for a couple weeks, until the word got out that I'd become a follower of Christ. People kept coming up to me and saying, what is going on with you? You just something's different about how you, everything from how you carry yourself to way you talk to others. And so I just had one of those Paul on the road of Damascus conversion experiences, and have sought to follow the Lord ever since. So
amazing. So yours was an experience first. You saw Gail experience Christ. That was interesting for you. At least it caught your attention. So
right.
Your intellect and your philosophy began to morph and mold and build from the original Road to Damascus experience. Is that true?
Mm-hmm. It is. And as I got into college, and then right out of college, went into campus ministry, I kept meeting students who were like I had questions, sometimes legitimately, sometimes as smoke screens, but nonetheless questions that I wanted to be able to help them work through the way Gail had helped me. So I'd do my homework, try to find some answers, some apologetic resources maybe that I could give to them, and that was helpful. But as I did this, I kept running into questions I just couldn't answer, and I realized there's got to be more to this. There's got to be more depth, and unfortunately, I wasn't around folks who could point me into the kind of next level of apologetic resources. And then the ministry I was with had summer seminary classes offered. And the summer of '87, I took a class from J.P. Moreland, a Christian philosopher, called Philosophical Apologetics. Philosophical Apologetics. And it was that next level I was looking for. It delved into issues in philosophy that underlie apologetics. Fields such as metaphysics, what's real, epistemology, what can we know and how can we be sure, and ethics, what's right. And that really helped me understand at a deeper level what the students were asking and how to answer them. And so as I went back on campus in the fall, realized, boy, this is so practical. This is really meeting students where they are. So I kept taking more classes in the summers from him and others, and ended up going out and taking my master's and doctorate under him, because I really think JP brings not only the intellectual goods, but also a deep commitment to spiritual growth and maturity, as well as ministry activism, which is the three elements that I think really ought to go together in the Christian life and ministry.
Ministry activism, can you explain what that would mean?
Yeah, just not staying in the library all the time studying things, but actually being out, engaging people in ways that help them see the grace, truth, and beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Amazing. One of the things that, Dr. Moreland is one of my, kind of heroes. He's somebody that I just have high admiration. He's one of the most gracious people that I've interacted with, and I appreciate that heart. The family tree, if we look at philosophically, is Dallas Willard, who mentored Dr. Moreland, who mentored you. Did you get a chance to ever interact with Dallas Willard?
I did. Not a lot. When I was out in L.A. taking my master's with JP, a time or two, JP and I went down to USC and visited with Dallas. We'd go to his office and sit. And JP would, I think it was just, he'd have an issue he was working on, wanted to get some counsel, some input, and just took me along as a student of his to sit as a fly on the wall and listen in. So those were great times.
Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. My name is Patrick Norris, and I am a husband, father, pastor of 35 years, and a strategic therapeutic mentor to leaders in all arenas of life. I am an inerrantist, a Calvinist Arminian betweenist, a Holy Spirit continuist, and a finished work of Christ redemptionist. Red Ink Revival was designed to create a revival in the heart, soul, and brains of Christian leaders from all spheres of influence. Our team of pastors, psychologists, and therapists facilitate our life-changing leadership, personal growth, and emotional wholeness experiences. Our goal is to bring a revival, an integrated wholeness to pastors, church staff, the local church, and the universal Big C church around the world. This includes marketplace leaders, educators, foster adoptive parents, and so much more. If this podcast is providing value to you, would you consider subscribing to it wherever you get your podcast? Also, please like the episodes, comment on them, and share them on your social media feeds. And one more big favor. If you like the show, please go review it at Apple. And if it's true of you, give us 5 stars. Now let's go back to this week's episode.
Well, I know JP talks about Dallas as being, and of course Dallas was at the top of the heap at USC, University of Southern California's philosophy department. And JP says that he was the most like Christ of any human that he had ever met. Just for a second, do you mind just sharing what that might be referring to? What would it be like to have that level of admiration from J.P. Moreland and said that it's like Christ? What was Dallas like that made him say that?
Well, and I didn't know him that well. I had those few interactions, and he spoke at a conference or two I did. So that was really all the direct interaction I had. But even from those brief encounters, there was a certain, and it's almost ineffable. It's hard to even put it into words, but there was a serenity, maybe is the best word, a quiet confidence in knowing Christ and walking with Him that just seemed to pervade his ambiance, the way he communicated, the way he thought about issues, the way he thought about his work and calling, and just didn't get caught up in all the trappings of being a senior scholar at a leading university and all the accolades and all the publications and yada yada yada. But at the end of the day, just another person like the rest of us, saved by the grace of God and trying to love Christ.
Well, the reason I point that out is because you have Dallas, who many who were around him, and not many as in there were a lot that were around him, but those who were really reflected the experience of a spiritual hunger, a desire to know God the way that Dallas did. And then, of course, now with you being kind of a spiritual son, a mentee of J.P. Moreland, J.P. to me has those same features. Yeah. And so that then I look at you and I'm like, Stan, you're such a good guy. And, I don't know you well, but what I do know is that you're humble, you're gracious, and you are very, very capable. And you have this big heart for scholars. You care about scholars. Primarily these professors that are in secular universities. I personally cannot imagine what it would be like to be a professor in an acoustic culture where if you even believe in Christ, you are considered a non-intellectual. You are considered less than. You're considered simplistic. And for you, as you are such a tenured philosopher in your own right, in apologetics and so on, you are leveraging it as an assignment by God to that community to help not just the professors, but also students who find themselves in secular universities and they're drowning with all of this barrage of weaponry that the secular world has against them and for them. So if you would talk to us a little bit and help us kind of grab onto Global Scholars as an organization. What is it that you do and what difference do you see it making?
Sure. Well, as with everything, there's a backstory and there's usually some personal connection, right? So I've got to go back to my freshman year in college. I was at Miami University in Ohio. As I mentioned earlier, a rather recent convert. I'd been a believer by that time, about 18 months. And I had a number of professors that freshman year who were pretty antagonistic to the gospel. And I just started to wonder, what have I gotten myself into? Boy, all the folks here who seem to know what they're talking about think this stuff's really a bunch of bunk. And so maybe I need to rethink this. And then I became aware of a professor not in my field. He was a historian, so I actually never had a class with him. But I just became aware of him. His name was Dr. Edwin Yamauchi, and he was a Christian. And that was really helpful to me. I realized, boy, so there are people here who are equals to my professors who believe what I believe. That was a real encouragement. And I did get to know him. He was very warm and welcoming. Even to students who weren't in his classes or in a history major, we could stop by his office anytime, and if we had questions or problems, talk with him. And that made such a difference in my life, just knowing him. And having even very little, I didn't have a lot of time with him, but just knowing he was there and every now and then being able to stop by his office. And it turns out he was part of a small network of Christian professors on campus. It seems that in the U.S., about 2% of the professors at any public university are Christ followers.
Wait, how many? How many? What's your percentage?
From my experience, it's 20 years in U.S. faculty ministry, it was 2%.
Wow.
So God has his people there. You can read that as a negative, but I read that as a positive. God has his people there. He's raised up men and women and called them to the university. And interestingly, research has been done that shows that 2% of a culture, any subgroup, what have you, is all it takes to see widespread change. It's in a book by a University of Virginia professor, James Davidson Hunter, called To Change the World. And it's pretty definitive in terms of really cultures are changed by a very small percentage of people who have two things going for them. One, they're in positions of influence, like professors. And two, they're networked together and sharing resources to be effective. And he gives all kinds of examples from the French Salon movement to the LGBT community, to the Jewish community, and others that are a very small percentage of different time and places, populations, but have had extraordinary influence on cultures. As opposed to a kind of bottom up, the cultures change one soul at a time, one person at a time. So if Hunter's right, and I think he is, just 2% of the U.S. professorate who are Christ followers, if they're united and they're resourced and equipped, can have an indelible impact in higher education.
Amazing.
And the same is true in every country of the world. And so what we do is we work as global scholars to help those Christian professors find one another and be encouraged that God has called them to this place for such a time as this, and provide the necessary resources, training, and equipping necessary to really have the type of influence Christ would have them make in their context of the university and their academic discipline.
Yeah. So what is your vision? On your website, I was reading about equipping a number of professors in all the nations that you have in your heart. Talk to us about your vision of where this can go and what impact it can have.
Right. Well, the ultimate vision is that every Christian professor worldwide, we estimate there are 750,000 Christian professors worldwide. There are no statistics on that are hard and fast, but that's an extrapolation from what we do know. So our vision is everyone would be connected with one another and equipped to represent Christ in their universities and in their academic disciplines. We have some short-term goals. We'd like to, reach certain milestones at certain points, but that's the ultimate vision. We do that through 14 programs and services that are really the necessary processes and resources that need to be provided. We're working now in 68 nations. Of course, we want to equip professors in every nation. We believe God's raised up professors in every nation, including places like North Korea, where we are engaging some professors. So, again, God has his people in these places of influence. And to bring it full circle personally, here many years after I was that young believer in university, I've got two boys who are at public universities, Kansas State and KU. I'm a house divided these days.
Yes, you are.
And so I want them to have Christian professors like a Dr. Y in their lives, and and have the kind of influence that he had in my life.
Yeah. Do you provide certain services for students themselves? And like your podcast, College Faith, tell us who that demographically is targeting, and if we have parents who are listening or pastors who want their college students, attenders, to have access to great philosophical apologetics, talk to about that.
Yes. So Global Scholars focuses on professors. Now, we do offer some limited access to resources for graduate students and postdocs. So when you say students, I assume you're referring to undergrads, but I will say if there are grad students or postdocs who are listening, visit there's a Christian Professional Society that we've been a part of helping establish that we really try to support, and that's where I'd suggest that they go, which is the Society of Christian Scholars, and that's where these programs and services we're developing are provided. So that's for students. Again, it could be undergrads who are maybe upper division and really have a sense that, God's calling me to the academic life and world, but it's usually more the graduate student level. The College Faith podcast is really for high school students, college students, their parents, their grandparents, anyone concerned with during that stage, those undergrad years, helping them flourish in both heart and mind. So I try. The way it's come about is over the 35 plus years I've had in campus ministry. I've had many folks come up to me, whether students or parents or grandparents, and say, how do I flourish, or how do I help my son or grandson or daughter flourish? And I always think, I've got a few things I can share, but I know who you really need to talk to. Now, that probably can't happen. She's busy. You don't know that person. But boy, if you could talk to so-and-so, it'd be great. So I decided I'm just going to start interviewing these folks and asking them the questions, and then whoever wants to can listen. And so that's been a lot of fun. I've been doing it about a year. I've actually got 4.5 years lined up. It's a monthly podcast, so many more to come, which I'm excited about. But trying to really help students and their parents get answers to those questions about how do I thrive as a Christian in a public, not exclusively, but usually focus on within a public, quote-unquote, secular university context.
I love it. And then you have Thinking Christianly. Who's that targeted to? And incidentally, the one you did, this last one on inerrancy with Dr. Moreland, golly, I sat there thinking, I wish I had the language that you guys have, because the concepts I understand, but the language you guys use, and it just rolls out of you like it's just the easiest thing you ever did. I encourage every parent, any listener, to actually go and listen to that. It's one of the best presentations of inerrancy that is relational conversation. Sometimes when people present the teachings of it, it can get so kind of into the weeds that people can get lost. This was conversational and beautiful. So Thinking Christianly, who's that targeted to?
Yes. Well, so I'd say the same audience, students, parents, grandparents, or anybody who is trying to follow the greatest commandment to love the Lord your God with all your mind, in addition to heart, soul, and strength.
Love it.
So whereas the College Faith podcast is really kind of practical stuff, nuts and bolts stuff. I had one College Faith podcast on how to get better grades and have more fun. Very practical study skills. The Thinking Christianly podcast is more the ideas that shape the university, culture, our world. We're going to record one tonight, actually, on the image of God and how that makes a difference in how we think about life and ethical issues and a whole range of things. So it's more the ideas that shape us and shape culture.
That's so good. I can't wait to hear that episode. Well, one of the things that you have done that I want the audience to hear you tell the story of, just because it's so powerful, with you being in Global Scholars, leading it, and the fruitful vision that you are pursuing. Back in '98, you were hosting a debate between Anthony Flew and William Lane Craig. Anthony Flew is a leading atheist, and William Lane Craig is a leading apologist, Christian philosopher. And they had this big debate, and I'll just let you pick it up from there. Talk about that debate, what it was, why it was, and really the interactions with you and Anthony afterwards and how he began to shift. Can you talk us through that experience?
Sure. I do have a series of articles on my website where I go into a lot of the details, so I'll touch on the high points, and folks can read those if they're interested in more. I was doing faculty ministry at the University of Wisconsin, there in Madison, as well as some of the other UW schools. But it was a challenge because the standard narrative was among faculty that no thinking person believes in Christ. And so it was actually hard to engage faculty because there was this presupposition that this was irrelevant, sort of like the flat earth. You know, you can't even get a conversation started about the flat earth. It's not in what's called the plausibility structure. It's not even possibly true. So we're not even going to talk about it. So it seemed to me that if we could have a world-class Christian scholar on campus to speak, and better yet, to debate maybe a world-class atheist on the topic of God's existence, that might open the conversation up a little bit. And by God's grace, so I wrote to a couple folks. I have known Bill Craig for some time, and so I wrote to him, and he was like, yeah, I'd love to do that. And I'd say Bill Craig is the leading Christian apologist of our time. Then I wrote to Anthony Flew, who was really the leading atheist of that time. He's passed since. But and he agreed as well. And it was fortuitous in that it was, as you mentioned, the 50th anniversary in 1998 of the famous Bertrand Russell Frederick Copleston debate on God's existence, which was broadcast on BBC Radio and is anthologized in most philosophy of religion textbooks. Many people read it. So it was sort of Flew was Russell's heir, and Craig was Copleston's heir intellectually in some ways, and in terms of spiritual commitment. And so it was just a nice way to frame the debate. So they both agreed. We set the debate up, so on and so forth. Well, when they both showed up in Madison, Wisconsin, somebody needed to kind of take him around, get him to their hotel, make sure they got to the debate on time and all that. So they needed a liaison each. And since I knew Bill, I wanted to be his liaison, but I needed somebody to be Tony's liaison. And so it turned out, again, God's fingerprints were all over this. There was a gentleman named Mike Murray, professor of philosophy from Franklin and Marshall, who's a believer, Christ follower, who was doing a one-year sabbatical there at Wisconsin-Madison, working on a book. And I'd gotten to know Mike, and we had lunch each week and talked about everything from growth in Christ to issues in philosophy that he or I were working on. And I realized, Mike's worked a lot and actually wrote his dissertation on something related to some of Flew's work. So knew Flew's work really well. And so I asked Mike if he'd be Tony Flew's liaison. He said, sure. So the debate occurs. Mike has taken Tony back to his hotel, and this is just a sign of, I think, a person who's a seeker of truth. Tony said, and Bill Craig clearly won the debate, and Tony was aware of that. And he said on the way back, I'm not sure I really followed Bill's line of reasoning on a certain argument. What was he trying to say? Well, Mike, knew a lot about the issue and was able to unpack it a little bit. And Tony said, that argument might work for God's existence. I have to think a little more about that.
Wow.
Which Mike told me, I think, the next day when we had coffee or something, and I was just amazed. I thought, oh, my word. What's going on here? What's the Lord doing? Well, fast forward a year. As I think you mentioned, I had a book contract for the debate, and the book was to contain an introduction by the moderator of the debate, a Christian philosopher there at Wisconsin named Keith Yandel. He had written that. Chapters 2 and 3 were the debate. Chapter 2 is the debate, and then the next 8 chapters were responses, 4 atheists and 4 Christian philosophers responding. And so the last 2 chapters were to be a response to the responses by Bill Craig and Tony Flew. So I, a year later now, sent them each the manuscript containing all those chapters for their response. And I got a letter back from Flew, and I actually pulled it out. I got it right here. A handwritten letter, airmail from Britain, and he basically says, you know what? I just have to be honest. I'm going to have to write a different chapter than you initially asked me to write. You'd asked me to write a chapter defending my arguments in light of the responses from the others who've written their chapters. I've been forced, I'm quoting, I've been forced by some fresh evidence and arguments to conclude that it is possible and even likely that the universe may actually be the creation of the God of traditional Christianity.
Incredible.
This is dated December 29th, 2000. That started him.
Let me jump in right there. When I even read about his reaction, his interaction with you afterwards, I'm assuming that he just decided that, okay, I will give up that there is a God. What he just said right there is that it wasn't just that there could be a God, probably, and then said, probably the God of Christianity. That is just amazing to me. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just
shocking.
needed to feel that with you.
It was shocking. Well, and so this just started him on a journey, and you know, he was a consummate scholar. Just did his homework, so to speak. So he began a journey of reading more and more in favor of the arguments that he'd found convincing that Bill Craig offered, and in critiques, and actually several, in addition to Bill Craig, several other Christian philosophers who were former debate partners of his, including Gary Habermas, who he debated the resurrection on in a famous book, and Doug Geibert. I think he had debated miracles on, or at least Doug knew him. Those three at least stayed in touch with Tony for a number of years, and both engaged him in his intellectual journey, but also pastorally ministered to him and cared for him. And I don't know where he ended his journey, but he certainly at least was a theist, and I don't know where it went from there.
Yeah.
But
yeah. What a great story. Oh my gosh. I just love that story.
Hey, have you ever wanted to explore how your backstory is influencing your present story? Have you ever wondered why you were driven the way you were driven, or why you want the things you so deeply want, or why you might be triggered the way you're triggered? Maybe there's something in your life that keeps derailing you or exposing the fractures in your heart and soul. At Red Ink Revival, I facilitate groups of 6 to 10 men or 6 to 10 ladies in an exploration process that includes worksheets, tools for discovery, and insights into personal motivations, torments, and reactions. And it's all done online through Zoom in a short 6-week experience. Now don't worry, you won't be required to share anything you don't want to. Your story is yours to share when and where you're ready. But first, you owe it to yourself to know what that story actually is. Our alumni report having life-changing experiences and integrations in all spheres of life. They report it actually felt like they entered into a revival. They even say they now lead others like never before as they instinctively map their teammates' own story considerations. We're developing groups specific for individual classifications like senior pastors or spouses, church staff, educators, foster adoption parents, marketplace leaders, and churches at large. Go to redinkrevival.com and find the events tab to learn more.
One of the things I want to pivot into now is that as a pastor, I went to a Bible college, non-accredited Bible college that, I gained so much. You hold just like a family of origin, you hold the beauty and the wonder of your family as well as the honesty of the story. And I'm so grateful for the spiritual leaders, fathers that have spoken into my life. There's some things that I've continued to grow in and I've analyzed and I've thought through, but I've always just fantasized of having friends, at least a few friends, that would be scholarly and that would hold the kind of academic, robust understanding that like you do. So the next question is going to be around that. With Red Ink Revival, Stan, we love to help people work through their historical stories, their families of origin, to help them understand why they do what they do. I think one of the great books that captures this idea is Dr. Moreland's book, Finding Quiet. And so I have enjoyed watching his journey. I have a very similar journey with panic attacks that I had, and a lot that we do with Red Ink Revival is from the suffering that I experienced for years and didn't have to. And so I just want to help others not deal with what I had to deal with, or give them the tools so that they can exponentially become better rather than incrementally like I did. So one of the core areas that I work with is understanding the soul. The soul. What is the soul? I grew spiritually with the kind of framework that we are tripartite beings. We are a spirit, we have a soul, and we live in a body. And it has served well to kind of try to systematically understand other things in my Christian faith. Yet I do, in these days, begin to think there's more to it than maybe what I just had perceived, and maybe even need to reassess the tripartite approach altogether. But when you think of the soul, what is it that you think about? How do you define the soul? Where does the soul and then the spirit work together? How does the word heart enter into that equation? And, I asked J.P. Moreland this, and we spoke about it for probably 3 minutes, but I got Stan Wallace in the house. I want to pull this apart for as long as we need to, because it's so critical for me to understand so much of human behavior. So if you would, help us with it. What is the soul, the heart, and how does it all work?
Okay, well, first of all, you should have spent more time with JP on that, because he's a man, but I'll do my best. You've asked some great questions, and I hope I get to all of them. If not, circle back.
You bet.
So this question is a question of theology and philosophy. By the way, that was a distinction that didn't exist until really the Enlightenment, so they're really the same thing. So I'm going to ask it philosophically/theologically. Okay. And I will give you just a sort of basic definition and then a more technical definition. Okay. So basic definition is the soul is our immaterial dimension. It's that part of us that thinks, that feels, that chooses, that desires, as opposed to the things that we use to touch and feel and be in the world per se physically. So that's kind of the rough and ready basic definition. Now, I think you're asking for a little bit more. So let me drill down a little more technically. And I've written on this a couple of articles. So if anybody's interested, it is on my website. There are 3 key words that define the soul, and each of them are very important. Each of them are technical, philosophical terms. I'm going to try to give just a summary definition of each of them. But a soul is an individuated human nature. Okay?
Individuated human nature.
Let's unpack those. What do those mean? So let's start with a nature. What is a nature? A nature is an essence. It's what something is. Okay? Each type of thing, and this is what Genesis is talking about, where God created each thing according to its kind or its type. It's a certain set of qualities or properties that are true of all and only that type of thing. In this case, a human type of thing. All right, so that's the second one. So we are a human nature. It's the type of essence we have, the human type. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means we've got a certain set of capacities or properties that together all and only humans have. Some of these properties are intellectual. Properties have to do with our ability to think, do higher level reasoning, etc., etc. Some of these capacities are emotional. Some of these capacities are volitional, abilities to make choices. Some are actually spiritual capacities. I'll return to that in a moment. And some are physical capacities, capacities of soul to relate to a body in certain ways, to connect to the body in certain ways, so that it turns out there's a deep, deep connection between soul and body because of that, and we'll return to that as well. For instance, I want to go downstairs to get a drink. I use my leg muscles and tendons and bones to actually make it happen. So I interact with the world in certain ways to accomplish that which I desire, which is part of my soul, my desires. So we're a human nature, but we're individuated, because I'm a human, you're a human, but we're not the same human. We're individuals. So the soul is that individuation of the human nature. Okay? By the way, which I think is also the best explanation of the Trinity. 3 persons, same nature, individuated into the 3 persons. But that's another conversation. So that is what the soul is technically.
Okay.
And the soul and body, therefore, have a deep, deep unity. Not unity. Causal connection.
Gotcha.
Where what happens in our soul affects our body, and what happens in our body affects our soul. Here we can get to the next level, but this is one of 2 views historically of the soul-body relation. This is the view that is not as popular, but I think is right, that I'm articulating, okay? This is the view that comes from Aristotle through Aquinas into Dallas Willard. It underlies his book, The Spirit of the Disciplines, etc., etc. And it's this idea that soul and body really do connect in deep, deep and fundamental ways. And that's why Dallas talks about, when we do certain things in our bodies that are spiritual disciplines or practices, it affects our soul. When we fast, a physical practice, it affects the growth and posture of our soul, right? Yeah. And things we do in the soul affect our body. We worry a lot. We develop ulcers. So the causal connections go both ways.
So worry is, in what you just said, worry is in the soul.
Yep.
So it's not just in the body, which the brain would be a part of the body. So you're differentiating the brain from the soul's mental capacities.
Yeah.
And you can you keep going, but I just wanted to clarify that.
Right.
As
That's
a
great clarification. Yeah, I'd be distinguishing the mind and the brain, or the body and the soul. And yes, as we have anxieties, thought patterns, etc., it actually then affects the brain. Makes certain neural pathways that open up, etc., etc. In the same way that if I, if I want to get down the road to go get dinner, I'm going to use my car. I'm not my car, but I use it to accomplish that purpose, and my mind uses my brain by shaping it in certain ways to respond to the world in maybe healthy but maybe unhealthy ways, right? Yeah. That's why we talk about ingrained thinking, where we've got ideas that are ingrained that it's hard to think in other ways about, because we have thought so long about it, it's ingrained it in certain neural pathways. So there's that deep causal relationship that's really important. Now, let me mention, by the way, that this is one view that it's growing in its popularity again these days, somewhat because of the work of JP and some others. It's called Thomistic substance dualism, because it's a view that we have a duality, 2 parts, body and soul, and those are substances, which is a technical philosophical term, which simply means basic realities. Our mind isn't reduced to our brain isn't reduced to our mind, for instance. They're both basic things. But it's Thomistic in that it comes through Aquinas, his writing. That's what is referred to when you say Thomistic. The other is the view that comes from Descartes through Plato, and I just said that backwards. From Plato through Descartes, and it's called Cartesian dualism. That refers to the ideas of Descartes, which kind of see the mind and body as kind of like water is in a glass. Yeah, the soul is in the body, but it's a very superficial relationship, and there's no connection between the two. You know, when water is poured in a glass, it doesn't change the water, doesn't change the glass. They still are what they are, and they don't really affect one another, except the glass shapes how the water happens to be. So it's a very superficial and temporary relationship. And so in that view, what happens in the soul has no effect on the body, and what happens in the body has no effect in the soul. This has implications on your view of biomedical ethics. For instance, I published a piece with JP, actually my first published piece, on how this influences our views of euthanasia and other end-of-life issues. It affects our view of the spiritual life. The Gnostics, early heresy, had this view, and so really what you did in the body wasn't that important because it was all spiritual stuff. I mean, we get it today in the church where, you know, the important stuff is prayer and Bible study and church attendance, but not what we do 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. That's kind of the worldly stuff, right? So it has permutations all through our thought and our lives. But I've probably gone quite far afield of your question, so I'm going to.
Oh no, you're doing great. I'm just. This stuff has so much in it. And if it weren't for its practicality of how we experience life and relationships, it might be something that I would be like, you know, I know what I believe and keep moving. But what we believe about this really has massive implications in our mental health, our emotional states, our sense of fulfillment, our relational intimacies, all of it. And so we even when Jesus would talk about believing with the heart, there's a distinction there. Mm-hmm. That there is not just believing in ways that are extra from the heart, it's believing with the heart. So that makes me think, well, you can't just run by that. I want to know what that is. What's he talking about? So thank you for offering even these two streams. So you have, you know, the stream that, again, goes from Thomas Aquinas, and then you have the stream that goes from Plato into Descartes and so on, right? And that is how you postured it. Now then, as we are thinking, and I guess my brain goes to, you started with Aristotle and Plato.
Your mind goes
is that a threat? What's that?
Your mind goes to.
What did I say?
You said your brain goes to.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Well, that's something that I'm interested in even knowing the tweak of that and why that's important. But before we get into that, I'm aware that your whole two streams start with Aristotle and Plato. Neither one of them were apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. So that feels like a threat to so many within the Christian community. Why are we even talking about stuff that starts with Aristotle and Plato? Can you answer that?
Sure. Briefly. It's a long conversation. But,
I bet it is.
The summary is God is the God of all truth. He knows all truth, and if he chooses to, he can communicate truth any way he wants to. Yeah. And he's chosen to communicate truth in two ways, what's called through special revelation and through what's called general revelation. Special revelation is his word, scriptures, as well as the living word, the person of Christ. And general revelation is his revelation through what's created. Romans 1 talks about this, how we can know certain things by just studying the created order. Proverbs is full of this. Consider the ant. You learn certain things about the way the world works and what's true by just looking around and studying stuff. And this is actually the reason that higher education developed in the Western world within a Christian context, because there was an assumption that we can know God's truth by studying other stuff besides just special revelation. And so as people have studied and thought and tried to evaluate kind of what's going on here, and Aristotle says philosophy begins in wonder. You know, you just wonder about something and think, wow, that's glorious, which actually has theological overtones already. There's a certain glory to this creation. What can we learn about the Creator and this reality by just studying it? So there's a long tradition of learning what Scripture touches on, but maybe doesn't go fully into, because it's not its purpose. And this is a good example. Philosophical anthropology is what we're talking about. And Scripture talks about it in as far as it's related to salvation or spiritual formation or other things. But there's a lot of nuance in terms of these issues that it doesn't address because it's not the purpose of those books.
How would you like to reboot your personal finances this year? How would you like to take control of your money, turning small wins into big results? I want to encourage you to check out my wife Tina's financial coaching business at tinanorris.org. You might be wondering, what is a financial coach? A coach is someone who will personally team up with you to outline financial goals, inspire you with energy, help you stay focused on your goals, and so much more. You can do it all through Zoom, and she provides a free initial consultation, so there's no pain or cost to you for your first steps. Maybe you've been to several Financial Peace University cycles, left with great intentions, but struggled to execute. You need a trainer, a coach, another human that won't shame or judge you to help you stay on track. She works with clients that are single parents, everyday people, pastors and church staff, as well as high-income professionals. If you have friends, church members, clients, or even young marrieds that are launching their financial lives, you'll do them all a favor to have them check out this amazing option. If professional athletes need a coach to win the day to fulfill their dreams, then you and I do too. And you won't find anybody better to help you get there than Tina Norris. Set up your free consultation from anywhere in the world today. Go to tinanorris.org to find out all the details.
Yeah. Well, I think of Jesus doing parable teaching around farmers and the science of farming. So let's say that there was a secular philosophy who was the greatest farmer of the day, and he's the one who gave the language to that farming. And then Jesus says, hey, if you really want to understand spiritual truth, here's a parallel that'll give you insights and understanding. So even Jesus leveraged it. So I'm right there with you. Well, let's go back to the idea of, I mentioned my brain says, I do say that a lot. My brain says whenever I'm experiencing something, because of the neural pathways, and taking from JP's work, he likes to talk about how that the brain would be the CD that the information's housed on, that the soul is actually the CD player. Or do I have that backwards?
CD encoder. And
okay.
Arguably player too, but yeah.
The
ideas we have, we use our brain to think as we use a hammer to nail a nail.
There you go.
Yeah.
So even what you were a moment ago kind of checking, which I love, man, anything you can help me expand. I trust you. You're somebody I value. So when you move me from saying that my brain says, and then you said your mind says, is there something more there, or is that just kind of more fun?
No,
okay, talk about it.
There's a lot more. I think this is one of the most challenging issues we as Christians face in the modern context we find ourselves. The entire Enlightenment project. Enlightenment's a period of intellectual history, roughly 17th to 18th century, that really tried to get rid of God and most things that are related to God, including souls and moral values and anything immaterial. Very empiricistic in a lot of ways. Not only there's another stream, but again, nuance. But the point is that a very strong theme from the Enlightenment was that everything we think is immaterial can be reduced to material. And one of those things were souls. So there are no such things as souls. There's really just physical stuff that does all the, not only all the heavy lifting, all the lifting, period. There is no such thing as an immaterial part to your being. And of course, if we lose that, the notion of the soul, therewith it goes any notion of sin, need for a savior, salvation, afterlife, spiritual formation. Of course, all these things are gone because there's no soul where those things would happen. And so it's a pretty important thing. Now, there's reasons why people are inclined to do this, to make this reductionist move, to reduce the mind to the brain, and that permeate culture and show up on the magazine covers at least 2 or 3 times a year that I see, where it's talking about, this part of the brain is where your thought is. And the reason is it's easy to confuse constant conjunction with identity. In other words, it's easy to confuse two things that always go together but are different with actually those things being identical. So, for instance, we see certain neural activity, and we also see a thought of lunch. Well, there's a conjunction between those two things, and again, I've mentioned earlier why that is, because of this deep unity and causal connection between mind and brain. But it's easy to make the leap, which is a logical fallacy, but nonetheless an easy leap to make, to say, well, because there's a constant conjunction, because when we see this neural activity, we see this person having a thought of lunch. Therefore, the thought of lunch is nothing but, or reducible to, or identical with that neural event. Okay? It misunderstands what identity is, which is actually a concept that if one understands the nature of identity, it becomes clear that these things are different things, and it's actually an argument for the soul based on the difference between a mental event and a brain event. But that's easy to miss. So. As Christians, we know this kind of theologically, but it's sometimes hard to transfer it into kind of the modern milieu and conversation about that's reductionistic about mind and brain. For instance, Jesus says to the thief on the cross, "Today you'll be with me in paradise," and the assumption is, and you'll know you're there. Mm-hmm. You'll have an awareness that you're actually with me in paradise today, which is a mental event. But the brain won't be there; it'll be in the grave or wherever they. Put that thief. So, so it's clear that the mind and the brain aren't different, and the mind is thinking, in that case, without the brain, and is aware of being in paradise. Or Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:8, it's better to be absent from the body, including the brain, and present with the Lord, which again assumes there's an awareness of being present with the Lord. But again, you're thinking, you're aware, you're rejoicing, you're worshiping without a body, without a brain, but those are all still mental events. Yeah. So, as Christians, we know this is the case theologically, but sometimes it's hard for us to translate that into kind of the modern conversation. Now, I'm going to mention one more thing, and then I'll turn it back to you, but you got me on a roll here.
Good, I love it.
This is a perennial problem for secularists, because as there's more research done, more thinking done, it's harder and harder to explain the reduction of mental events to brain events. In fact, and the people who work in this actually are not neurophysiologists. They're practitioners. It's philosophers of mind. They're asking these broader questions about what's the nature of the brain, what's the nature of the mind, as opposed to, kind of how do these things function, which is the practitioner's question, which is an important question, but it's a different question. So philosophers of mind who are atheists really do struggle with this. In fact, John Searle, who is retired now, is at UC Berkeley, wrote a paper not long ago. Well, that's a little while ago now. Time escapes me. But he basically said, looking over the last 50 years of trying to reduce the mind to the brain, we got nothing. We're just kind of stuck. This is really hard to get figured out.
Yeah.
So it's one of the strongest arguments for against naturalism, against the view that all there is material stuff. Yeah. That there is a soul, and so we've got to be careful. And in fact, it's what bothers me about some folks who identify themselves as neurotheologians, who make this move and are taking this reductionistic move. I just reviewed for somebody a book called, and I got it here, called Renovated by Jim Wilder. And a nice guy, I'm sure, got a pastor's heart, but the book is just awful in terms of almost every page has these misunderstandings and fallacies of reductionism. And I see it in Kurt Thompson and others who call themselves neurotheologians, which I think is an oxymoron to start with. But again, great heart, I know pastoral desires, but just not being careful in their thinking about these issues. And some of it is because these are issues that are in philosophy of mind, and you do need to have some background in those issues to really make these distinctions. And often we no longer have a university where there's a unity of knowledge where different people are talking to one another. And so in this case, the neurophysicists and the philosophers of mind don't talk to one another, and so it just gets kind of messy.
Pastors, ministry senior leaders, and spouses, we host a monthly Zoom event that is with a psychologist, therapist, and me. We usually have around 15 to 30 other participating pastors, spouses, and leaders. The Pastor Monthlies have been amazing to help pastors collaborate around tactics, personnel changes, and even how to navigate their own inner world. The skills you will learn and a newfound pastoral community will expand your leadership mapping with everyone you lead. These monthly Zooms happen every month. Go to RedInkRevival.com and find the events tab to find out more.
So those are
I
lots of
love your
thoughts.
transparency, and I love that you're bringing your authentic perspectives, because I do think that we don't win when we have these opinions that are in conflict with each other and nobody's talking about them in a way. And one thing I love about you and JP and all the people at Biola and Talbot that, it's like we can disagree and talk about it, and then we're all better. I wish we did that more. I wish we had a think tank around that. Well, when you think of the brain, so I am aware of so much of the research that happens around the brain. You've got, for instance, the amygdala and the whole limbic system, which is considered the emotional part of the brain. The limbic system, housing in it the amygdala, which is typically thought of as the fight, flight, freeze, and if you go to the fourth, the fawn. And then you have the hippocampus that houses the episodic memories. It doesn't develop till you're 15 years of age. The amygdala, when you're born, is primarily fully matured, so you have all this emotional happening, even constructs to how you're going to interact with your relationships. So the theory is that by the time you're 1 year of age, your attachment injuries, or the way your brain is how it's stated, organizes around your primary relationships, bringing you to an attachment theory, whether you will be anxiously attached or securely attached or insecurely attached, and then you have to gain the tools to be able to process through that. When I think of, as an example, the anterior cingulate gyrus, which is the part of the brain that we have theory on that releases things like oxytocin that will calm the amygdala's cortisol releases. And when the anterior cingulate gyrus has this function, it is activated by things like gratitude, compassion, empathy. So first of all, do you believe, you're smart. You study everything. Look at the books behind your head. You read everything. So do you believe in the brain functioning as I just described, or is that reductionist as you're talking about reductionism?
Yeah, great question. I appreciate the way you frame that. Yes, I again, given my view of general revelation and the value of research and study, I think scientists in the field of neurophysiology have discovered amazing things about how our brain works, and it is not my field, and I am happy to follow their understanding, well-researched, documented, et cetera, as you've laid out. What I want to be careful of is saying, therefore, a thought is nothing but, or an emotion is nothing but. It's the nothing buttery that's the problem, right? So it is certainly true those things happen, just as it is certainly true that a hammer drives a nail into a board. And a physicist can explain all of the physics that cause that to happen. But the fact is, I don't want to say it's nothing but a hammer that drives the nail on the board. It is a hammerer. It's a carpenter. Yeah. It's a person who uses that tool to accomplish an end. And so in the same way, I don't want to say that those things you just described are all there is to the story. No, there's a mind that is using them to accomplish its ends, which is, again, part of the nature of the human soul, is to accomplish certain ends of emotional maturity, intellectual maturity, volitional maturity, ability to make right choices. And that's how God has designed us to accomplish those ends as humans, is through certain physical constructs, at least in this life, including a brain.
Yeah. Well, help me with this, because when I use, and I'm going back to the tweak that you offered me, and again, I'm grateful. So I don't get to spend time with somebody like you very often. And so I want to squeeze as much out of you, partly because I feel security with your theological, robust understanding of things. And that makes me feel, because where do I bounce this stuff off? Where do I have a chance to learn these things? And when you, a moment ago, were talking about, I said, my brain tells me, and you said, your mind, when I say my brain is offering me something, it eliminates the shame factor for me, because it in essence says there's an assumption in conversation that if your brain is saying it to you, that it is based in family of origin, there's injury, there's faultiness already there, and it normalizes that. Where if I put it in the mind and say my mind says, that to me can make me feel as though I should be different. I should be transformed by now in my mind in that area. And I don't altogether know why that is a separation for me, but how would you hold me by the heart and take me into a better way of thinking about all that?
Sure. Well, I think I'd start with the biblical notion that the fall has affected every dimension of creation, which means it's affected every dimension of us, which means it's affected both our soul and body. So no matter where you locate that, it's because of the fall. Because we're sons of Adam, fallen in him, but we also are being redeemed, and not just our soul, but our whole being. So the gospel is that God will redeem all things, right? Ultimately, the hope. And so, again, whether you locate it in brain or mind, it is redeemable and part of God's desire. So I don't think it matters pastorally where you locate it, because of fall and redemption. Now, philosophically / theologically, those are things I think have to be rooted in soul, not body. Again, for the philosophical reasons I mentioned, the causal connection of the soul, again, the CD player writing the code. So it's ultimately the soul, the thoughts, the beliefs, the desires that shape that, fallen as they are. And theologically, biblically, as we think and exegete texts that talk about spiritual formation and how we develop Christ-likeness, those are all soulish activities, right? Renew your mind, Romans 12, 1 and 2 is the key passage, right? The transforming of your mind so that you can approve what the will of God is. All of the exhortations in the pastoral epistles, for instance, to study to show yourself approved, or to say no to sin and yes to righteousness, etc., etc., etc. They're all choices, thoughts, desires to cultivate. They're all those kind of things that happen in the soul. And so all of spiritual formation is grounded ultimately in Scripture, in soul activities, not brain activities. Though, again, to reemphasize, the soul uses the brain to accomplish those ends.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm, and again, just fascinated by all of the way that you think through that. When you were talking a minute ago about the reductionist, and you named some people around it, it seems like that, and I don't know the Wilder at all, and again, I'm not in any way diminishing who he is or what he's about. I don't know anything about him, and even if I did, I would still want to celebrate the good. But I do know that when we're talking about the mind in the areas that you find problematic, and I do too, is the kind of the family tree of thought that goes from the neuroscientist Dr. Dan Siegel, who probably identifies as a Buddhist or a Universalist, and then some of the ideas that have gone around him. He wrote a book on the soul, and he makes the soul a material thing, and he makes it a group relationship thing. That the mind is when multiple people come together, and that's where others who have been in relationship with him and studied and so on, they begin to move in that way. Can you just for a minute critique why that is so problematic? Obviously, making it immaterial or making it material and not immaterial is, to me, that's where I find the off ramp. That's where I'm like, that doesn't makes sense to me based on the scriptures you used, based on the rich man and Lazarus, that he's dead, he's in Abraham's bosom, but he has emotion, he has thoughts, he has memories that were from the time that he was on the earth. When I look at all of that, the mind has to be immaterial. And so let's, obviously that's a big point, but just for a moment, talk about the group component to the mind as Siegel would talk about it, or any of the others who kind of followed him.
Right, sure. And Wilder talks about that in his book, and then I offer some thoughts in my review. So first of all, I'll make 2 points. There's some other things we could get into, but to start with 2 points. One, think about any relationship. What's required for there to be a relationship? What's required are there have to be two different things to be in that relationship. Technically, they're called relata. You need two or more relata entities that then stand in a certain relationship to one another, above, under, greater than, before, whatever the relation. There have to be something that exists prior for the relationship to come about. So the soul can't be formed by a relationship because there has to be something already to be in a relationship. And so it's just a logical error to say relationships cause things when you got to have things to start with to even be in that relationship in the first place. Okay, so there's just no way.
You're so smart, man. Honestly, who thinks about this stuff? That is so amazing for you to even be able to divide that out that way. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, this is not original with me at all. But you know what it is? It is understanding categories and understanding what things are in their essence. And in this case, the category of relation, which is different than the category of substance or the category of property and so on and so forth. And just understanding those things helps to unpack some of this.
Pastors, did you know that upwards of 70% of the men in your congregation are regularly accessing pornography, stuck in shame, torn in conflict, and therefore immobilized for zealous ministry? That's 7 out of 10. The problem is not going to go away. What are you doing to lead your men into wholeness? Porn and sex addiction is characterized by undesirable compulsive behaviors that feature incongruence with personal values, and it interferes with normal living, causing stress on their relationships with God, family, friends, loved ones, and possibly even their own work environment. Well, where do you send men to recover and become both whole and integrated? Red Ink Recovery offers a unique program exclusive to porn and sex-related addictions. Our clinical professionals, our psychologists and therapists, have created a transformative treatment process that collects the dots, connects the dots, and corrects the dots that have driven the addictions. Our approach heals the heart, restores the soul, and rebuilds the neuroplasticity of the brain. Our clients find their lives have been wildly marked by Christ as they are given a path for trust being rebuilt. And they are resourced for far greater relationships and intimacy than they have ever known before. All of our professional teammates are experts in the field of sexual addiction. They are all trained by Dr. Patrick Carnes and certified by the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals. Dr. Carnes is known as the father and curator of modern sexual addiction recovery as a movement. Pastors, we encourage you to recommend your men who struggle to come to one of our intensives. If you are just a simple man that struggles, maybe you're new to the faith or you don't even know what you believe about Christ, be encouraged to join us. We will honor your journey and give you the tools to live in wholeness. To find out more about our porn and sex addiction intensives and when the next one is, go to redinkrevival.com.
Second thing that's important to understand, and think about this in all of the things we've already said, is the inescapable words that are used are me, I, we, they, okay?
Yeah.
All of those are actually references to a soul. So, you say things like, I am in a relationship, or my soul, or my brain, or my thought, etc., etc. It all refers to a self that's not identical with that thought, that relationship, that brain event, etc., etc. These are actually called indexicals. They index me, you, him, her, them, okay? And they actually index a soul. So one of my critiques of Wilder is he spends a lot of time trying to explain how his soul is his neuropathy in certain ways. And I just want to ask, well, who's the he you're referring to? Because there is no he or I if I'm just talking about brain events. These are just isolated events that have some causal connection to one another, but there's no haver of them. There's no I that has a brain event. The minute you start talking about I, you're talking about you're using an indexical to refer to a self or a soul that's the haver of properties, whether they be physical properties in the brain or mental properties in the mind, like a thought or an emotion. And me being in a relation causes the soul. It's already contradictory because it's already using an indexical, the I, that's in a relationship before the relationship can happen. So it's a little bit of a different spin or take or way to say the same thing in terms of the relata has to exist before the relationship can obtain.
So good and so interesting. What is the spirit? What is the heart?
Okay, so and you're getting into the bipartite, tripartite debate. Are we two things, body and soul, or three things, body, soul, and spirit? Good people disagree on this. I've got a view, think I'm right, could be wrong. Okay, I'm just going to give you my view, make a case for
Love
it. But again, somebody could argue against me, and I'm not going to die on this hill. But it seems to me that we are two things, body and soul. And we have a spirit. Yes, it's true that we have a spirit, but it seems to me the spirit is a range of capacities within our soul. Remember, our soul has sets of capacities that are related to one another. So intellectual capacities that are different from but related to volitional capacities, right? I think in certain ways, and so I choose certain things. I think, boy, I really want ice cream, so I choose to go get some. Okay, there's a connection there, but they're different. Or I believe in certain ways, and so I think in certain ways, right? I believe certain things about myself, and so I have negative thoughts. So there's this causal connection, but they're different, a belief and a thought, okay? Well, another set of capacities are the capacities I would refer to as spirit. That's the capacity to relate to God, to have intimacy with God. I think it's another way to say the image of God, the Imago Dei. Now, the Imago Dei might be more than that, but it's at least that. It's something that we have that even the angels don't have, and other created things don't have. That image of God, that ability to have a intimacy with God and call him Abba, Father. And that capacity or ability is what I believe the Spirit is that range of capacity in soul to have intimate relationship and knowledge of and communion with God.
And is that what gets born again? Is that where salvation happens?
Yes. In other words, or to unpack it, I think the fall covered over, though didn't annihilate those abilities or capacities. In other words, in the fall, we lost the ability to exercise those capacities. Just like a child born with only a brain stem loses certain capacities to exercise, ability to exercise capacities of thought, although she still has those capacities. She just can't exercise them because there are certain other things that are blocking that. Well, in the same way, the fall causes us not to be able to exercise those capacities to relate to God in the Spirit. And regeneration is those capacities again being enlivened or made accessible to us so that we can once again relate to God. Yeah. And by the way, I will mention that we do have an exemplar who has all of these capacities fully expressed, and that's Jesus of Nazareth. So he fully expresses what it is to be expressing every spiritual capacity, emotional capacity, volitional capacity, intellectual capacity, relational capacity, and that's why we strive toward Christ-like, or that's what it looks like to strive toward Christ-likeness, to fully express those capacities as he did. And of course, in the final state, we will be as he is and expressing those capacities fully.
And when the Holy Spirit is our helper, our parakletos, when he comes along to help us, he's helping us really in all those capacities, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why we have normative notions of health, emotional health, healthy desires, intellectual maturity. These are all normative notions of what we're striving toward, what Jesus is the exemplar of, and what we hopefully are growing into.
What is the heart? If the Spirit is our capacity within the soul to be able to connect with God, to know God, then what is the heart?
Right. Well, I think it's usually referring, when it's used in Scripture, to the same thing, our immaterial dimension. But sometimes it's used in just a sort of a physical way. So, for instance, sometimes as Genesis 6:5 says, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Yeah. So clearly that's referring to not physical stuff, the heart per se. It's referring to the seat of our emotions, of our choices, of our desires, right? Actually, the next verse, Genesis 6, uses the same word used of heart for us to refer to God. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So, God doesn't have a physical heart, obviously, but he has a heart. So that's usually what it's referring to, I think, when it's used in terms of our spiritually.
Some of the scriptures that come to mind for heart as the center of energy and behavior and choices and so on. Matthew 13, Jesus makes the statement, out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, so on.
Yes.
We see Ananias and Sapphira. Why has the devil put it into your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit? John 13:2, the devil now having put into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray. So it seems as though when something gets in the heart, whatever that is, there's going to be energy for behavior. Even if a man looks on a woman to lust after her in his heart, seems to indicate that it's not just you had a thought going through your mind. It is now a momentum preparing you for, you've decided I'm going to act on it. Yeah. How would you, again, let's move into what you understand of the heart with all that background.
Right, sure. And I think a Hebrew scholar would be better versed at this because it has a deep connection to the Old Testament understanding of the person, and the heart is the seat of one's being, what I'd refer to philosophically as the soul. So exegetically, there are important things there that I think have to be unpacked. But
the soul and the heart would be similar,
yes,
same.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. The innermost being, the ultimate who you are.
Okay.
In fact, there's I think this Thomistic dualism resonant all through the Old Testament scriptures of this deep interaction and relationship, because this heart is so central to you, including your physical, that you are referred to as one thing. You're one entity. That's why some actually are driven toward a reductionist view. John Cooper, in his book Body, Soul, and Life Everlasting, does a good job of unpacking this, and I think explicating this exegetically in a really helpful way.
Let me break in one more time and tell you about RedInkRevival.com. That is REDINK Revival.com. I want to encourage you to go there and sign up for our blog e-newsletter. Every month it will hit your inbox with a blog post and new special events that will ink your soul with revival.
So the soul has capacities in it. So would it be fair to kind of imagine them as compartments, or is that get off somewhere? But compartments where you have all these, capacities to be able to do things, and the spirit is where we access. It's our capacity to know God. The heart, the way you're describing it, sounds like it's very similar, if not the same, synonymously to the soul. Is there more there? And then what I want us to move into as we wrap it up today is, how do we make sense of therapy, of psychological therapy? Because we are, therapy is in its goal transformational, which is what sanctification is ultimately about, is our process of being like Christ. So talk about the soul, the spirit, the heart, and then what's it mean therapeutically? And if we can kind of keep it in that therapeutic framework as much as we can, perhaps, then, as people are working on themselves, they're not kind of getting stuck with religious presuppositions, which often does seem to keep people from thinking about how they could pursue health. So talk about it.
Boy, good questions, and a lot of them. So, I do think, to summarize, heart would be synonymous with soul. It would be that set of capacities that makes you what you are, and that you express in either healthy or unhealthy ways, and hopefully growing more and more toward healthy ways. The word compartment is helpful. Again, all analogies are going to break down somewhere, but it's helpful to think of it that way, different compartments of the soul. But it breaks down if you think that they're airtight, sealed compartments or containers. Because each of them is connected to one another. So I'd see it almost as a spider web with these nodes that all have lines connecting to one another that have these causal relationships back and forth. And then that relates to therapy, et cetera, because those relationships are so deep and intrinsic that when there's something that's gone awry in one dimension, it affects all the other dimensions. And so, a holistic approach is important. So somebody has wrong thoughts, it's going to affect their beliefs and their desires and their choices. So those wrong beliefs have to be addressed. But somebody has because of the fall, certain desires that are askew. That affects what they think about things and what they choose. And so it's addressing the whole nexus of these different capacities or properties of soul that I think is the call of the counselor or psychiatrist or psychologist. just as it's the call of the physician to address problems where the body has ceased to function appropriately. Again, there's a normativity there, and he or she has training to identify where that function is broken down and know how to help that function get back to a good place. And by the way, and I was just talking to somebody who's a physician who's also studying some of these issues in philosophy of mind, and she was just making the point that she in her medical training never saw, and it was never discussed, these connections between soul and body, and she's seen so much more in her practice how some of the ailments she engages really are issues of the soul that are affecting the body, that she has to help the patient understand that I can't just fix this. You're just not a machine that I can just fix. Some of this has to do with certain beliefs and choices you're making. And conversely, I think psychiatrists see this often where there's certain bodily functions or processes or patterns or habits that affect their mental health and well-being that have to be addressed.
Yeah. So good, Stan. Well, I just want to say thank you for giving your life to what you have and the journey God's put you on, because what a gift that even this conversation is to me. And in full transparency, I've longed for conversations like this because where do you have these? Who thinks like this? And yet, I know me, I don't want to be off. I don't want to be, outside of good biblical doctrinal positioning, and yet I'm very hungry to develop and to grow, and I know what I've come out of with, as I said earlier, panic attacks and other kinds of relational injury and suffering, and so I just want to offer that. So anyway, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today.
Oh, this has been great. It really has.
So let's wrap this up with how can pastors help with Global Scholars initiatives?
Well, I appreciate the question. I'd say three things. Pray. One, we have a monthly prayer calendar on our website, global-scholars.org. And each day of the month, there's a specific prayer request. We'd love to encourage pastors and their congregations to join with us in interceding for the universities of the world, the professors called there as believers, and the students being shaped in those places. Secondly, I would encourage pastors to tell the professors in their congregations about the Society of Christian Scholars, to help them connect with other Christian believers in higher education and be encouraged, find some resources, and be able to increase their influence for Christ. And third, I offer a college faith seminar that can be done in any format, from a lunch and after church to a weekend event, where I go through a lot of the things that high school students need to understand to flourish when they go off to college. So they can find that on the College Faith website, collegefaith.net, and send me a note, and we can get something scheduled. So that'd be a lot of fun.
Oh, that is amazing. That is awesome. Well, do you have any final words you want to offer to our listeners, and ultimately how can people find you and all your resources?
Sure. Okay. Well, good. Let me just, as a final word, say something about a broader theme we've been talking about, and that is, I think we all need to be careful, and we're all guilty of it, I as much as anybody else. We need to be careful not to embrace the latest fads intellectually. C.S. Lewis wrote a great little article called On Reading Old Books. And in it he says, there's sometimes you should read old books. Why? Not because they got it all right. They got their own issues, But you'll spot their issues because they're not yours. But by reading them, they're going to think about things in a way that you, just because of your cultural background and baggage, wouldn't think about things, and it'll correct your thinking. I think that's good advice more broadly to, be aware of not just the current fads and ideas and conversations like this Christian physicalism and reductionism we've been talking about, but to be aware of the broader conversation and issues. In fact, I've got a series of articles where I go through the 15 current fads, so to speak, and I say current, coming out of the Enlightenment. I think it's called How Not to Be a Chronological Snob, which is the term Lewis used for thinking that what we think today is the only way to think about things and always the right way. So that's just an encouragement, I think, to be careful in loving God with our minds by thinking about things in broader ways. So hopefully a word of encouragement. And you also said, where can people find me? My website, stanwallace.org, is where you can find my articles, both things I've written for publication as well as articles I posted on that site, and the 2 podcasts I do are linked there, as well as my ministry site, global-scholars.org.
Awesome. Can't wait to get to do this again sometime, man.
That would be great.